administrative things. So I don't know if Ade sent out the link for handouts yet, but there's a whole, so what we're going to talk about today is basically transitioning, if you want to set up your own company, transitioning into OPT, and then possibly, you know, what you can do after that. We're also going to talk about, well, what if you don't want to set up your own company, maybe that's just not going to happen, and you need to go a more traditional route, which is having an employer sponsor. We're going to talk about that, as well as green card options. All right, so while I'm still doing administrative stuff, there is a QR scan there if you want to upload, download the handouts. So there's like 90 pages of handouts. So I'm trying to go green, but it's in the link that Ade is going to send as well. So, but there's a handout on H-1Bs, on every type of green card. So everything we talk about today, it's going to be covered in here. All right, so usually when I do these workshops, I always tell people the first thing you want to do is, so it's kind of weird in this corner, use your resources. So if you do have questions throughout the year or when you transition into OPT, if you guys have questions, the 3 worst things that you can do is, number 1, don't call USCIS customer service. Have any ever actually called it before? No? You can call USCIS customer service 10 times. You're going to get a contractor, and you're probably going to get 10 different answers, so don't drive yourself nuts. Number 2, if you do have questions, don't spend, I know it's the 21st century, and Google is pretty much your friend most of the time, but please don't Google your immigration situation. Don't spend a lot of time on different chat groups and forums. You will drive yourself nuts. All right. Number 3, if you have questions, be very, very careful when you're sort of out and about and you're at a dinner party or something, and your girlfriend's best friend's sister says to you, oh, you should do this because I did this 10 years ago, or, oh, I know someone who did this. Just remember that there are some similarities, but generally, your situation is your own unique situation. You're not going to find the answer listening to someone third hand, fourth hand. You're not going to find it on the internet. You want to be smart about using your resources. So when I say use your resources, what do I mean? You have great resources here on campus. So number 1, use your international office, OIS. There's great counselors there who can answer a lot of your questions. USC also does lots of workshops throughout the year. I'm usually here twice a year as well on campus doing those workshops, and they have other attorneys come on and do them as well. And then the other resources, you'll find that OIS has a list of attorneys, of immigration attorneys that you can call. You are welcome to use me as a resource as well. So if you have questions, you will find that most immigration attorneys don't charge a consultation fee. All right, so you are going to get free advice, usually in 10 or 15 minutes, or maybe half an hour, depending on how complicated your situation is. If it is, we can resolve it in 15, 20 minutes and figure out a strategy for you. And most lawyers can also do that. All right, so don't drive yourself nuts calling USCIS or going on the internet. Use your resources. All right, so number 1 question, since you're all still on F1, the question I get a lot is, well, what can I actually do? Can I actually start a business? Can I set up my corporate entity while I'm on an F1? So while you are still in school, before you hit CPT or OPT, what can you do? The test from a U.S. immigration perspective is, are you physically in the U.S. and are you performing services for a U.S. entity? All right, if you're physically in the U.S. and you're performing services for a U.S. entity, that constitutes employment. You need to have the appropriate visa to do it, which means if you set up your company and you're running your company and you're doing business, you are not allowed to do that when you're an F1 student unless you've got permission to do so. All right, sometimes I hear students say to me, well, I'm not going to be paid. It's not about payment. All right, immigration doesn't care about payment. It's about performing the services while you are physically here in the U.S. The next sort of question that people try and get around then is, well, what if I'm running the company, but any money that we make is going into my bank account at home in my home country? Same thing. If you're performing services in the U.S. for a U.S. entity, you need to have a work permit. All these workarounds don't really work. All right, so that's during school. So what can you do? Right, so just as an aside, sometimes I get questions from people who say, well, can I just, I'm just going to advise a friend's startup, maybe I'll make some sort of passive investment, I'll be on the board, but I'm not really running the company. So passive investments are okay. You can have ownership as long as you are not hands-on running the business, right? So let's just say you actually want to set up your company and you want to set up a corporate entity, whether it's a limited liability company, a corporation, a sole proprietorship. Can you do it? Where do you cross the line? So in theory, you can set it up. Sometimes it's advantageous to have a partner that you set it up with, but where do you cross the line? I mean, if you are sort of in development phase, that's probably going to be okay. The second you start monetizing, the second you start generating revenues, chances are you've crossed the line. Right? So you want to be very, very careful about doing it. Now, for those of you who are grad students, and some of you maybe who are who are undergrad still, there is something called CPT, or curricular practical training. And CPT allows you to do internships during school, so during your F1 before you graduate. Typically, if you're doing an internship program, sometimes you sign up for a class that's an internship class and you get full credit for it. You might be able to do CPT and do an internship at another company or perhaps with your own company. Sometimes it's part-time, 20 hours, sometimes it's full-time during summer, sometimes it's paid or unpaid. But CPT is all handled internally by the school, and it's going to depend on whether your program allows it. All right, so this is where you have to be very careful. You may have a friend over at the other school where the Bruins are in Westwood who maybe has CPT during their summer, but your program may not allow it, and that's because of your restrictions that USC may have. All right, so the perfect example, if you're doing an MBA at Anderson and you're doing an MBA at Marshall, Anderson students can do full-time CPT during second quarter of their MBA, during first year, whereas Marshall students have to wait until this summer. All right, so CPT is handled internally, so it's going to be different everywhere you are, so you have to check with your school. There's no J, so I'm not going to talk about academic training, but CPT may allow you to work during school before you graduate. Now, once you graduate, all of you are familiar with something called OPT, right? Optional practical training. Yes? Who has not heard of OPT? Good. Who's done the OPT workshop at OIS already? Who's graduating this year? All right. If you are graduating this year in June or July, you better know about OPT and you better go do your workshop. And you should have submitted your application already for OPT. All right, but OPT is like a gift to you. All right, it's unrestricted employment for 1 year after you graduate. Unrestricted employment means you can work anywhere you want. It has to be related to your field of study, right? But you can work anywhere you want. You can be an employee, you can be a contractor, you can be a freelancer, a consultant, you can work for multiple companies, you can start up your own company during OPT. All right, but what I'm going to talk about in a little bit is if you're going to set up your own company during OPT, you want to make sure you've got a long-term strategy, because what are you going to do at the end of your OPT if you don't have a transition strategy? All right, but OPT. It's not an OPT workshop. I'm going to tell you guys you have to do the OPT workshop at OIS, but timing. You can apply for OPT 90 days before you graduate, 60 days after you graduate. You want to apply early. Why? Because immigration is going to take close to 90 days or more to actually adjudicate your application and give you your little work permit. All right, it's called an EAD, which stands for Employment Authorization Document. It's a little work permit the size of a credit card. Apply early. Now, the best thing about OPT as well is you don't need a job offer. You fill out your form, $410, photo, off you go. All right, so whether you are going to be working for someone else or doing your own startup, make sure you apply early. Also, apply no matter what. Why apply no matter what? Every year I have people who are sort of like, oh, I have my dream job lined up in the Bahamas or Sydney or London. I don't need to apply for OPT. I'm not going to stay in the US. And then inevitably what happens is maybe the day before they leave, they get offered their dream job, really their dream job, but the offer is to start on Monday, and you didn't apply for OPT. It's going to take 90 days, 3-4 months to get your OPT. That chance is gone. So for $410, just apply for OPT to keep your options open. Now, once you go onto OPT, there are very strict reporting requirements, all right? If OIS hasn't drummed that into you already, reporting requirements mean when you move and you change addresses, you have to report, but it also means you have to report your employment. Every employer, whether it's paid employment or you're doing an unpaid internship, you need to report it. Why is that important? Because there's a 90-day unemployment provision. All right, what does that mean? It's pressure, it's a lot of pressure on you guys to find a job anyway, but it means that you cannot collect or accrue more than 90 days where you don't have a job. So if you're gonna take one thing away from today, one way to make sure you never collect any days of unemployment, volunteer 20 hours a week, right? Again, in your field of study. So go and do something for a startup, all right? Go do some research for your professor. You have two right here, all right? Something 20 hours, unpaid internship, and you can stay on your OPT all year without actually having a paid job, right? So nobody should ever be in a position where you're calling me frantically saying, freaking out, saying, TL, I'm on 89 days of unemployment, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna say to you, what were you thinking? Why didn't you volunteer 20 hours a week? Because you could have, then you don't accrue any days of unemployment. So remember that. All right, so OPT, 12 months, unrestricted employment. Now, all of you are basically computer science grads, right? Or all STEM, right? Science, tech, engineering, math. Anyone not a STEM major? Just quickly, because while your hands are up, are you business? Marshall? Okay, just close your ears for a second. For everyone who's a STEM major, you are eligible, may be eligible, for an extra 2 years of OPT. What are the conditions? Number one, you have to have a STEM degree. Number two, in order to get your extra 2 years of OPT, you have to work for a company that's registered with a government program called E-Verify. Now, there are a lot of companies that are registered with E-Verify, but if you go to a smaller company, sometimes a startup, they may not be registered with E-Verify, and if your company is not registered with E-Verify, you cannot apply for, you won't get your extra 2 years of STEM OPT. All right. Now, if you are on STEM OPT, there's no volunteering, and you have to be an employee of the company. So if you're going to do your own startup, you have to set up your startup in a certain way where you have minority ownership and you are considered an employee. Just to go back from my Marshall, so you're all MBAs?
Undergrad.
I'm sorry, what?
Undergrad.
You're undergrad business majors, or, okay. Any of you grad? Non-STEM? What are you?
MSSC, Social Entrepreneur.
Is that a STEM? Okay, what's your undergrad?
Accounting.
Okay, the point I was going to make, for those of you who are in a master's program but that's not STEM, do any of you have a prior bachelor's degree that's STEM, a US degree that's STEM? Okay, so then, that's okay. Then I'm going to move on. Was that a question somewhere? Yeah.
Is it difficult for a company to be E-Verify?
That's a good question. It's going to depend. Usually if you go to a small startup with not many people, chances are they'll probably do it for you. Sometimes if you go to a mid-size, like somewhere where there's some structure already, it is an administrative burden for some companies to do E-Verify. So I have some clients who just won't do it because it's too much extra work. I have some companies who, because they tend to hire a lot of kids straight out of school with STEM degrees, they'll do E-Verify. It's just case by case, depending on the employer.
But it sounds like if a company wants to sponsor or hire international, they will require E-Verify.
So sometimes if it's just a one-off, they're unlikely to do it. But if they see that their future is going to be in hiring probably a lot of internationals coming out with STEM degrees, chances are they'll probably do it. So it's a business model.
Are there a lot?
Look, a lot of tech companies are all E-Verify because otherwise they wouldn't be able to hire international students. Okay, so OPT again, it does give you the opportunity to set up your own startup if you want to. All right, but you want to make sure you've got a long-term plan, because what are you going to do at the end of OPT if there are no visa options for you? All right, so typically, so I have to ask a question. For most of the time, if you've set up your own company during OPT and you want to transition, the traditional way to transition is to what we call an investor visa. It's an e-visa. But to qualify for the e-visa, your country has to have a treaty with the US. And, all right, and in your handouts, there's a handout info sheet on ease with all the countries that have treaties with the US. Unfortunately, Brazil, Russia, India, China do not have treaties. So I'm just going to ask the question, how many of you are not from India or China? Okay, it's a handful. Just keep your hand up and just tell me where you're from.
Singapore.
Singapore.
Indonesia.
Nigeria, Finland,
Germany.
Romania, United Kingdom,
Korea.
Okay. So about half of you, you're a Singaporean?
Yes.
Okay.
Does Hong Kong count as China?
Hong Kong, but Hong Kong has no treaty.
Iran.
Iran, yay. Okay, so about half of you who raised your hands are from countries with treaties with the United States. So I'm going to spend a few minutes, not too long, talking about ease. If you guys do have questions about ease, you can always call me and we can chat about it. But just to give you a sense. All right. First, so number one, your country has to have a treaty with the U.S. Number two, at least 50% of the company that you set up has to be owned by people from, basically individuals with your nationality. If you are the owner investor, you can be 100%, but the minimum is you have to own it at least 50%. All right. There are two kinds. There's an E1 and an E2. The E1 is based on trade, and the E2 is your traditional investor visa. All right, so quickly, trade really, it's common sense, exchange of goods. E1s are typically used by import-export companies, so if that's what you want to do, you can also do that. Sometimes you can count services as well. And then the idea is your trade has to be substantial, and 50% of your trade has to be between the US and your country. So let's just say my Singaporean friend here wants to set up an import-export business. He owns 80% of the company, and at least 50% of his trade is between Singapore and the US, he can do an investor visa. My friend from the UK, somewhere there, same idea. Now, that's the E1. The more common visa that investors or startup entrepreneurs will use is the E2. And the idea with the E2 is that you have to make a substantial investment in your business. Now, substantial investment is relative. What they're going to look at is, okay, how much does it normally cost to set up this type of business? And is this the type of business that's going to grow bigger and better and create jobs for US workers? All right, now, substantial investment, some people, it's not a huge amount. All right, if you are from Singapore or Germany or Australia, usually $120,000 is enough. All right, we're not talking about $500,000 or $1 million. We're talking about 120,000. So it's not a huge amount. Same thing, you can do it if you're Iranian. All right, so, and you can be the owner investor. Thinking about setting up a tech consulting company, you have to be careful because what they're going to look at is this the type of business that's going to create lots of jobs, or is it just going to create a nice business? They're going to come back and say it's marginal, but the E2, it's a good way to set up your company. So typically, if you do set up during OPT, the traditional path, if you want to continue running your own business, is to do an e-visa, possibly. But your challenge, if you're from a country that doesn't have a treaty, obviously that's challenging. But for everyone else who wants to start up their own business or buy their business, the E2 is a good option to do it. Now, I'm going to skip this one because it's not a lot of you. The thing about the E2, right, first of all, if you do want to do this, I'm going to tell you, call me and talk to me, because what works in one country may not work in another. And this is where you see a lot of differences between embassies, because you can actually apply for your E2 at a US embassy in your home country, and you will see it's much easier to get an E2 in Australia and Singapore and Germany and France than it is for the UK. The UK doesn't tend to like the small startups. All right, they like and same with Japan, they like the bigger companies on the E2. Now, a lot of people think the E2 is sort of unattainable, but it's not really. But you have to take certain steps to show that you're committed to your company and that there's an investment has been made and it's at risk. Right? So it's a little bit of a catch-22 because you kind of want to just say, here's my idea, this is what I'm going to spend, give me the visa and I'll do it. The embassy doesn't like that. They want to see that you are committed and your investment's at risk, which means they want to see that you have set up a corporate entity. All right, so you have to set up an LLC or corporation. They want to see that you set it up, you open up a business bank account, you have to make a money transfer from your personal account into your business account. You need to find space, office space. I know it's the 21st century, but you cannot work out of your house or your garage or your apartment. Co-working spaces are totally fine, sublet from a friend. And then you have to spend some of that money. Let's just say if you put in $150,000 as your investment, if you spend $50,000, you'll get your visa. All right. Sometimes if it's a business where you may find it difficult to spend your $40,000 or $50,000, look, between your space and lawyer fees and legal fees to set up, buy some brand new MacBooks, you'll find that you can spend $30,000, $40,000. The more you spend up front, the greater your chances are of getting the visa. All right, but the embassy's not going to give the visa to you till they see that you are invested and that money's at risk. Right, someone had a question? So the business bank account for the company has to be in the US. Wait, sorry? So if your money, so let's just say you're using inheritance money or your family is being very generous and giving you the money, that money can come from your home country into the business bank account.
Okay, but the business has to be registered here.
In the US, yes. It can be a branch. Now, it can be a brand new company. It can also be a branch of a company that maybe exists. Maybe you have a family business abroad and you can set up a US branch of that, right? You don't have to hire people up front, but usually you also want to put together a business plan that shows, and it's what I call a soundbite business plan, all right? It's not a business plan that you're going to use to attract funding or investors. It's just a 5-10 minute flip through that an officer can flip through and get a sense of where's your market, how you're going to create jobs, what kind of jobs you're going to create, where you're going to be in 5 years, when you break even. Simple business plan. A couple of hands were raised. Yeah.
As for setting up the corporate entity and also the bank account, should we do it through like CBT, which where just that we mentioned that we could do that developing.
So what can you do during CPT or your F1 before you hit OPT? You can kind of get everything set up, but then it's got to be dormant until you either go into OPT or you get your visa. You cannot start generating revenues for business unless you have a partner or a manager or someone who is doing that for you so that you are hands off until you get your visa or your OPT. Yeah.
Just to reiterate, right? E1, E2.
So can you?
And just to reiterate, E1 and E2 are always a question for Indians and Chinese, right?
Yes. But, so one of the interesting trends from the last few years, the hot new passport is Grenada, right? I can't even tell you where Grenada is on the map, but the hot new trend is apparently it's very easy to get a second passport in Grenada. Look, what you have to look into is, do you have to give up your passport to get a second passport? There are some countries that recognize dual citizenship or triple citizenship. Other countries, if you take a second passport, you have to give yours up. But Grenada is the hot one, and Grenada has, so there are a lot of Chinese nationals who are getting second passports and then applying for e-visas with their Grenada passport, which is doable. Grenada. Someone can Google it and tell me where it is, what ocean it's in. Does anyone know?
Question.
This is terrible. Geography is terrible. Yeah.
Could you just speak a little bit more about the difference between E1 and E2 again?
Yes, so the E1, let me go back to that slide. E1 is basically, we call it a treaty trader, so it's based on trade. So 50% of your trade has to be between the US and your country. All right, so, but it's more common for import-export type businesses. What happens is some countries only have an E1 treaty but not an E2, so sometimes you have to get creative with your services. If you ever have the choice between an E1 and an E2, you always do an E2. Why? Because, look, if you are an import-export, that's great, but very often what happens is your markets or your manufacturers or whoever it is, your it changes. And if you drop below 50% of your trade between your country and the US, it destroys your E. Right? So we always try and funnel someone into an E2 so that you don't have that long-term problem. Yeah.
As for the E2, just now you mentioned that the U.S. entity cannot be generating revenue while we're off-season or usual situations, right?
Yes.
So what happens if there's a U.S. entity which owns foreign subsidiary corporate? Can that corporate be earning money itself like the U.S. entity? So this is a subsidiary.
So you're trying to funnel the work to the overseas companies? Look, if there are, so what you have to be careful of is, well, how are you doing it? Who's on the ground in the US signing your contracts? Who's negotiating or meeting with the clients? If there's someone on the ground that's not you and your name is not in any of the contracts and there's no public profile and that the work is being done abroad, maybe. But one thing we're going to talk about at the end. Some of you may know that there were some huge changes in summer of last year that with very serious consequences for F1s who violate their status. Violating your status is things like not reporting, working without permission, and we're going to talk about that. So you really want to be careful because remember, the orange man is the president, who's in LA today, who's going to destroy traffic later on if you're going somewhere. But it's hostile. It's a hostile environment, so you want to be very, very careful. Look, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this was very common where you guys would all set up companies and you'd be doing stuff on the side. It didn't really matter. It really matters now. All right, so you want to be careful. Yeah.
Is there an option that we already have an E2 visa and while working at another company?
So if you, let's just say maybe you do the traditional path and you get an H-1B, right? And you're working for Microsoft or Facebook or someone. You cannot be working on your startup on the side. That's considered unauthorized employment. You need a concurrent H-1B or something else. So if you haven't already figured out, the Americans make it very difficult to live and work here, right? If you're an international student or individual.
Is concurrent possible?
Concurrent is possible, and I'm going to talk about that later. Yeah.
If I have an online business that's working in Finland, we do nothing with America, nothing.
If it's an online business that's operating outside of the US and there's no US sales or anything, and there's nothing that's going to trace back to you doing US sales, technically that passes the test, right? You're physically here, but you're not working for a US entity. You're working for an overseas entity. Yeah.
So you set up an entity outside of the US, but that entity is doing business with US partners using that business.
So again, this comes back down to who's doing the work on the ground. Is there a team abroad that's, negotiating the contracts, signing the contracts, closing the deal, or is that you closing the deal?
So it's being that
If it's you, that's problematic. I think you've got to be careful.
It's not.
but it's not the US entities.
But so this is where, it gets more and more gray. All right, it's an overseas entity, but then you've got US clients, and are you working for your US clients? So his example was no US business, right? He's running a business that's abroad, that's doing business in Asia, Europe, but there's no US business. The second you start doing business in the US with US clients, I'm going to tell you, you should be very careful. Somebody else? No? Okay. All right, so I'm going to skip this real quick. Okay. So if you do, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't skip it. Let me go back. Sorry. Okay, so if you are interested in doing an e-visa, again, that's something that it's really hard to do with a big audience because they're very customized. It's going to depend on what country you're from. Some countries will accept lower amounts of investment, others not. But let's just say if you want to do an e-visa and you qualify, yeah.
Yeah, quick question. So what if you are graduate and you start working for a tech company on OPT for 3 years, could you be working on a side project?
So your first year of OPT, you can be doing a side project, yes. But if you go into STEM OPT, no. Because when you transition onto STEM OPT, you can only work for an E-Verify company and there's no volunteering. All right, so you kind of want to do it quick. Look, if you are, let's just say you do the traditional route and you go onto an H-1B for an employer, right? And you have this idea. Remember, you can get everything ready. So if you want to find your space, do your business plan, set up the company, start spending some money, and basically have the company be, and then apply for your e-visa so that the second you get the e-visa and you come back to the US, you hit the ground running and you can start generating revenues, you can do that. You just can't physically start generating business if you're on your H-1B.
Does that apply to H-1B1 as well for Singapore?
Yes. Any work visa, you have to do what you're supposed to be doing on your H-1 or H-1B1. Okay. All right. So just quickly, if you're interested in applying for an E2, there's 2 ways you can apply for the E2. Number 1, which is not the preferred option, is you can submit an application with USCIS here by mail. So you would be filing an application to change your status from F1 OPT to an E-visa. You can premium process it. You would get 2 years. All right. If you need to travel internationally after that, you're going to have to go to a US embassy. The better way to apply for an E-visa is to actually just go straight to the US embassy in your home country, unless you're from Iran, because then you don't want to go. Better way to do an e-visa is always you put your package together, you submit it to the US embassy in your home country, you go in for your interview, and then you come back in. Most countries, it's a 4 or a 5-year visa, and then you come in. Now, why do I prefer option 2 over number 1? Number 1, if you file by mail, and then when you get your 2-year, and then you have to travel internationally, before you can come back in, you've got to go to the embassy to get your visa stamped into your passport. Now, getting your visa stamped into your passport for an e-visa is different to everything else, right? Your F1s, you show up with an I-20, it's pretty much, they stamp your passport, you're good to go. H-1B, same thing, it's pre-approved by immigration, you show up with a passport, they stamp, you're good to go. An e-visa, they want to see your whole application again. They don't care that USCIS has already approved it. They're going to make their own decision. So if you do it that way, you end up filing twice and paying twice, which is why I always like to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and just apply straight at the US Embassy. All right, now, is there a reason you would pick one over the other? Sometimes, maybe if you don't have enough, if you don't have 100, 120,000 or 150,000 to invest, how low can you go? You can do, if you file with USCIS here, they're better with smaller investments. You can go as low as 60,000 with a change of status, whereas I would never send you to an embassy abroad with 60,000. All right, I think that's not a substantial investment. So sometimes that's one reason. If you are from Iran or from a country where the second you go out, you know you're gonna be stuck in security checks for 6 to 10 months, and you're gonna get a 1-entry visa. So a lot of you may realize your F1s in your passport, you have multiple entry, right? So you can come in and out as much as you like. You can ask your Iranian friend here how many entries he gets, 1. Right, so to do an e-visa abroad is really not worth it just because you use your 1 entry when you come in and that's it. All right. Another reason to sometimes do it stateside or with USCIS is if the country that you're applying in is just terrible for e-visas. You might not want to go home to do it. You might want to stay put and do it here. All right. And then we talked about getting a second passport. Grenada, did anyone figure out where it is yet?
It's in the Caribbean.
Caribbean? Okay, so close to the US. You can consider doing that. Are any of you married? Before I push a handful of people. The one question we always ask is, are you married and what kind of passport does your spouse have? Because maybe your spouse can apply for the e-visa, and there's only 3 kinds of visas that allow spouses to work. It's the J, the E, and the L. All right, so sometimes if there's a spouse who wants to set up the company and then you get a work permit which is unrestricted, you can also sometimes figure out a way to run your startup with that. All right, pros and cons of the E. If you really want to be your own boss and run your own business, obviously that's a good thing. if your company grows and you like to hire people from your country, so for example, my Singaporean friend sets up his company, it's majority Singaporean owned. If he wants to bring in any other Singaporeans as a manager, an executive, or an essential worker, just because they're Singaporean, he can bring them in on an E. So believe it or not, the Japanese car companies are huge users of e-visas. Toyota, Honda, Hyundai. A lot of their execs and managers are here on e-visas, just so you know, as an employee, because they set up in the US, majority Japanese owned or Korean owned, and they can do that. And then the best thing about the E is if you have a spouse who wants to work, they get an unrestricted work permit. What are the cons? Cons, you always have to make sure that your ownership stays above 50%. So if your model is to eventually give away equity through funding, eventually where you're going to drop below 50%, or if you are Singaporean owned and it drops below 50% Singaporean owned, it will destroy the E. So you do have to be careful of that. So you want to make sure that you sell with a ton of money and get your green card or something before you destroy your e-visa if you're on an e-visa. All right. And then the other kind of downside is going the traditional route for a green card is a little bit tougher when you're on an e-visa, because usually if you're on an e-visa, you want to be running your own company. You don't want to be working for someone else and having someone else sponsor you for a green card. All right, so there are ways to get green cards, but it might be a little more challenging. Yeah?
So you said there's a minimum investment with an e-visa. I'm Canadian, so going to Canada, is there like a set minimum investment, or there's just not involved?
So Canada, just so you know, Canadians are what we usually say they're visa exempt, which usually means if you go on to a TN or H-1B, you never have to go to the embassy to get an actual visa in your passport. You just show up at the border and you cross. The e-visa is the exception. If you do an e-visa, you actually do have to go to the embassy to get a stamp. Now, for Canadians, there's no minimum. Usually, between 100 and 150,000 will work for Canada. All right. But again, generally, they don't like the small consulting companies because they don't see how you're going to grow bigger and better and create lots of jobs. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear. Can I go back to the previous slide? This one? This one.
Oh yeah, so I was wondering for the ownership, are you talking about your single ownership or?
No. So where are you from? So let's just say your company is 80% Korean owned between you and maybe a bunch of other
that's
Korean
what I was
investors. As long as the company stays 50% Korean owned, even if your personal equity drops, that's fine. Okay. All right, so I did want to, yeah.
Quick question related to that. So that means you can raise funding from your home country and
Yes.
still have a minority stake.
Yes.
Okay. And then, but you can still sell to provide services to U.S. entities.
Assuming you've got the E, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay, so that's the e-visa the traditional way. Now, I spent some time on it, but so I think half the room, you may not qualify for an e-visa unless you get a second passport from Grenada, but we'll talk about H-1Bs. H-1Bs are like your meat and potatoes of immigration. Whether you're gonna try and do it on your own or whether you're gonna go the traditional route of having an employer sponsor you, I think it's important for you to know about the H-1B. All right, and you may have your own startup at some point and probably need to hire H-1Bs, so again, important for you. So it's a professional occupation visa, sort of the common sense way to think about it. What's a professional occupation? The H-1B job has to be something that normally requires a bachelor's degree in a specific field to do it. All right, so you're all mostly business CS majors. Your job should be related to that. If you have a CS degree and you're going to be a chef, you're going to have a problem because there's no correlation between the two jobs. So there are some examples of typical H-1B occupations up there. The H-1B is, so this is what I meant about OPT spoils you, because it's unrestricted. STEM OPT becomes more restricted because you've got to work for an E-Verify company. But you really want to use your OPT as a stepping stone, whether it's to do your own thing or to find an employer that's going to sponsor you for your work visa. So most people, your traditional path is to transition to an H-1B. When you transition, though, what we say is it's employer specific, which means you can only work for the company that sponsors you. All right, this is where you cannot do anything on the side. All right, but you can also have what we call concurrent employment. So when you file your H-1B can be part-time, it can be full-time, right? You can also have H-1Bs for multiple employers, which is where the concurrent employment comes in. So it's more common for certain industries. So I have a lot of architects and vets and physical therapists who work for different practices, and they have H-1Bs for different, multiple employers. It's just that every employer has to file an H-1B for you, which gets a little expensive, but it is doable. So in theory, you could have a full-time job with, a Microsoft or a Facebook or something, and then have a part-time H-1B with your own startup. It might be possible. We're going to talk about what some of the challenges are, but that's also a possibility. Now, typically your H-1B, they give it to you for 3 years. You can have it for a total of 6. There's a grace period now. This was one of President Obama's gifts before he left office. In the past, if you were laid off or terminated, there was no grace period, all right? But now, if you are laid off or terminated, there is a 60-day grace period, but only if you're laid off or terminated. If you just hate your job and you quit and you resign and you haven't got a plan B, that wasn't very smart of you because there's no grace period. All right, now, the way the H-1B works is there is a quota. Some of you may have heard about, we have our own March Madness in immigration because in March it's crazy busy trying to get all our H-1Bs filed for the first 5 business days in April. The quota is 85,000 H-1Bs for the entire private industry in the United States, which is nothing. It's 65,000 set aside for anyone with just a bachelor's degree, 20,000 set aside for anyone with a U.S. higher degree. We call it a master's cap and a general cap. Even the general cap, though, is a little deceptive because you'll see there's a carve-out. 6,800 visas just go to your friend in the front, to Singapore and to Chile, and the big joke is every year they don't even come close to meeting that quota. The numbers are supposed to go back into the general cap, but immigration's never been able to explain how they count, so we're all a little dubious about that. But that's for the entire country, all right? There are H-1Bs for what we call cap-exempt organizations, so it's nonprofit, research, universities, things like that, who have access to as many as they want. But for everyone else in private industry, 85,000. Just to give you some context, when I first started practicing, I'm going to age myself, late 1990s, first high-tech boom. There were close to 195,000 H-1Bs. So you guys would graduate, apply for an H-1B, you would get it, no worries. Now, so what happened in 2001 is they dropped it to the 65,000. So you can imagine utter chaos. April 1 would come around because that's your filing date. April 1 would come around and all the H-1Bs would be gone day 1. Right. There was one year where it was so bad, they had DHL and UPS and FedEx trucks lined up for blocks and blocks. They couldn't deliver H-1Bs. So what they do now is when they get too many, your filing window is the first 5 business days in April, right? So, and then they're going to run a lottery, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. Yeah.
So once you've been, like I've had an H-1B visa in the past. Once I've had that, still, if I reapply for another one this year,
So did you go abroad for at least a year after having the H-1B? Yes. And how much time did you use out of your 6 years?
I think it was something like 2 or 3.
Okay, so the good news for you, if you were abroad for at least a year, you want to maximize your OPT when you finish, and then you have 2 choices. You can either apply for, what I would tell you to do is apply for a brand new H-1B, go through lottery. If you get it, you're going to get 6 full years. If you don't get it, you fall back and you can use the remainder of time. So if you use 2 years, you've got 4 years left, and you can go straight back to H-1B without going through lottery. Okay. All right, so when you file an H-1B, this is also, it's expensive. The bad news is it's expensive. There's all sorts of government filing fees when you file an H-1B. So the first one is something called a training fee. It's $1,500 if your company has 26 or more people, $750 if you have a smaller company with 25 and under. That is an employer obligation, which means the company must pay for that. No funny business where you reimburse them or your parents or your grandparents write the check. The company must pay for that training fee. All right. Then the second fee is there's a fraud fee of $500, which they use to fund audits and investigations. Everyone pays the $500. Your regular filing fee is $460, and then if you have any family members, you pay $370 for the family. And then regular processing right now is about 6 to 8 months. Unfortunately or fortunately, money talks with the government, so if you want to pay them an extra $14.10 for their premium processing service, they will give you a decision in 15 days. All right, so those are all the fees. All right, so I was saying this before. Whether you go the traditional route, so whether you go to a big company or a small company or a startup where you may run into employers who've never done an H-1B before, and I'm going to talk about, sometimes you may want to consider doing the H-1B. You have to suck it up, go and work, go get your green card, and then you can go back and do your own thing and be an entrepreneur after you get your green card. All right, so I think it's important for all of you to know what the process is, because there are also a ton of employers who've just never done it before, who buy into all the myths and who think it's really difficult to do an H-1B, and they've heard that you have to advertise. All of that is not true. So it's important for you guys to know what's involved with an H-1B. So when you file an H-1B, you work with 2 different government agencies. You work with both USCIS and with the Department of Labor, right? First step 1 is the company has to sign something called a labor condition application, or an LCA for short, where they make certain promises to the government. The main promise they make is that they're going to pay you the prevailing wage for the occupation. Right? The prevailing wage is like a base salary, right? It's your base salary. You cannot count commissions. You cannot count benefits or equity or bonuses, unless your bonus is guaranteed every year. But that's your prevailing wage. And this is also where the prevailing wage is going to depend on what your job is, whether you're a marketing executive or you're a software engineer or a data analyst. It's going to depend on what the job is and where the job is, what city the job is. And this is where I can't tell you off the top of my head because there's thousands of jobs in different cities. But I can look it up. I can look up the surveys, and you're always welcome to call me and say, hey, TL, I got offered a job as a business analyst in New York and Atlanta and LA. And I'm going to tell you, okay, the prevailing wage for New York is this, for Atlanta is this, for LA is this. All right. Now, if the company is not willing to pay the prevailing wage, there is no H-1B. It's not even a matter of, hey, TL, can we try and see, what happens? I'm just going to tell you, don't waste your time, don't waste your money. It's not going to happen. All right, so prevailing wage is the big one. There are other promises that they make, things like they haven't fired anyone to hire you, that they're going to treat you the same as their US workers. And the whole point of the LCA is to make sure that employers don't undercut wages and working conditions. All right, so they sign the LCA, it gets posted at the work site for 10 business days, and it's submitted to DOL electronically. They certify it electronically, it comes back, and then the rest of it is forms, and there's a detailed support letter that kind of outlines what the job is, why a bachelor's degree in your field is required for it, how you qualified for it. All right, and that all goes off to immigration. That's the process. Now, typically as an employer, if you are the employer with your startup, or if you are having to explain this to the employer may say to you, okay, if I sponsor you, what are my obligations? What are my responsibilities? What am I on the hook for? If you go and get yourself arrested, do I have to pay a bond for you? What are my responsibilities? So the only obligations, they have to pay that training fee, $1,500 or $750, right? If they fire you, if they terminate or lay you off, they have to offer you what we call reasonable cost of transportation home, which is basically an airline ticket home. Economy, one way, not business, not first class, just you, not your family. All right, they offer it to you. They are also required to notify immigration that you are no longer there. All right, what else? I've got up there no benching. You all went through March Madness, and she wants to know what benching. Remember, the employer has to pay you the prevailing wage no matter what. All right, most people in the U.S. get paid every 2 weeks. The least you can do, the minimum you can do is once a month. But at the end of the day, you have to make that prevailing wage. So the employer cannot say to you, oh, we have a cash flow problem right now. Why don't you go home, take an unpaid leave of absence? I'll call you back when there's work. Or, take the next 3 months off unpaid just because we don't have any they're not allowed to bench you, right? They have to pay you your prevailing wage whether you're working or not, right? So that's important. Any material changes to the job, you usually have to file amendments. So if you're going from part-time to full-time to part-time, you have to file an amendment. If the office moves to a different city and county, that's also going to require an amendment. And you have to comply with all of these things, right? If you do something silly like get yourself arrested or you get into debt, doesn't matter. That's not on the employer. That's on you. All right. All right. So then typically the question is, well, with all of these fees, who has to pay for what? The only thing the company or the employer has to pay for is the training fee. Everything else you guys can technically pay for as long as it doesn't drop you below prevailing wage. Right, so the example up there, let's just say you get offered a job as a data analyst for 90 grand, all right? And the employer says to you, I will pay the training fee, I will pay you your 90,000, but I will not pay a penny more. The problem with that is if you pay the $500 fraud fee, if you pay premium processing, if you pay the legal fees, you are no longer gonna make prevailing wage, which is a problem. So then usually, in the old days, someone would raise their hand and say, oh, but TL, who's gonna know? It's not a big deal. Well, remember, every H-1B employer that files an H-1B pays a $500 fraud fee. Every L-1 employer also pays a $500 fraud fee. And what happens is they've been collecting these fraud fees for years and years. And back in 2008, I know it's a long time ago now, they came out with their first report. They only did about 250 site visits, but they found close to a 25% technical violation rate. People would file H-1Bs for a CEO or VP, and investigators would go out to the work site and it'd be a laundromat, gas station, so they weren't very happy. So they went out and hired thousands. It started with 1,500, they probably got closer to between 8,000 and 10,000 now. We call them rent-a-cops. They're really just contractors in suits with a badge. But they go out and they conduct worksite visits, right? Unannounced worksite visits. So they don't tell you when they're coming. And they're there to check on you. They've got a copy of your H-1B petition. And they're there to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. All right, now, when I say they've got a copy of the petition, and so they don't tell you when they're coming. The only time they tell you when they're coming is when they're coming to a campus like this and they want parking. Right, so that's kind of, with any university, they always want parking. But when they've got a copy of their petition, what you want to be careful of is you may find that you only have one job offer and the employer doesn't want to pay prevailing wage, or you want to try and get around paying the prevailing wage. So maybe you call yourself a market research analyst instead of the VP of marketing, right? Because why would you do that? VP of marketing, your prevailing wage is probably going to be 85 to 90,000. Your market research analyst prevailing wage is going to be 40,000, right? So it's tempting, but I'm going to tell you don't cut corners. Why? Because when they show up at your work site and they're waiting in the reception and they see all your business cards and your business card says VP of marketing, but your H-1B says market research analyst, or your LinkedIn shows something completely different. You don't want to get your H-1B revoked and you don't want to be put on a plane home to never come back to the States, right? So tempting as it may be tempting, but please, please, please be careful. Right, and the other, so also, not only they're checking up on what you're doing, they also ask to see your pay statements and your tax returns. They will ask who paid for what, and they'll want proof of checks and things. And the other place it also happens is some of you, when you go back, and it's more common in India and China, when you go back and apply for your H-1B visa, at the embassy they can ask you all these things, and if you can't show it, those two embassies will commonly revoke H-1B petitions, and it's going to leave you stuck at home. All right, so just really quickly. So one of the things that I was saying is lottery. All right, so when you file, everyone files the first 5 business days in April. They close it out on the 5th business day, and then they run a computer-generated lottery. This year they flipped it, so what they do is they run the lottery for the bachelor's cap first now, and then after they've reached the bachelor's cap, they run the master's cap. They think by flipping it, they used to do it the other way where they would do the master's cap first, If you have a master's or higher degree and missed out, you would get a second shot at the bachelor's, but they flipped it. They think it's going to be a 5% increase in master's or higher level people getting H-1Bs. Now, they run lottery. If your case is selected, you get a receipt with a receipt number and they cash your checks. Don't celebrate yet. You can do mini celebration because then it just means you were selected. Your case still has to go to an officer for adjudication. If you are not selected in lottery, what will eventually happen is they will reject your whole package to you. So you get your filing fees back and it's just, you just get your whole application back. Rejections are such a low priority, they don't come back till July or August. All right, but if you do get selected, then decisions start to come anywhere. Sorry, lottery, usually you know the results by end of April all through May, beginning of June is when people start getting receipts. One of the quicker ways to know if you're selected or not is you can check to see when the filing fee checks are cashed, because once they're cashed, you know that they've deposited your money and you were selected for lottery. Right now, believe it or not, so remember I said back in 2001, H-1Bs used to go on day one, right? And then it became the first 5 business days. Now, some of you may be too young to remember, but we went through a recession sort of, 08, 09, 010, and H-1B usage plummeted, because believe it or not, banks and financial institutions are heavy users of H-1Bs. And then we kind of saw a recovery. These are just the numbers for the last 5-6 years. You'll see high point 2017, which is really April 2016, 236,000 applications for 85,000 spots. Last year it dropped to 100. I still actually thought it was going to drop a lot more, but last year was still 190,000. This year, my prediction, I think it's going to drop again, probably to 150, 160, which is still a 50% chance of getting your H-1B, which is a little bit depressing, but those are your numbers. All right, now, another quick thing, yeah?
Why do you think it's dropping right now? Why do you foresee it dropping?
We're going to spend 5 minutes talking. It's the Trump effect. So what's happened with H-1Bs is, I'm going to talk about it, so you have to stay. Okay, so, yeah.
Can you explain the impact of changing thing as your personal?
Well, this is the first year they're doing it. USCIS thinks that by switching it, that a higher percentage of masters or higher students will get selected, because they run everyone for the bachelor's first, and then once that's full, then they run the masters. That's what they say. I don't. If you file an H-1B, all right, let me do this and I'll come back. If you do file an H-1B, now, how many of you are any of you graduating in December? I'm going to tell you, don't graduate in December if you don't have to. Why? So traditionally, for most people, what happens is you graduate May, June, July, you get your OPT. It's good for 1 year. If you don't have STEM OPT, it expires usually over summer. If you get your H-1B, it's only going to start on October 1st. So what used to happen is we used to have this gap over summer where your OPT would expire, and then you wouldn't be able to work until October 1st. So it used to create a hardship for the employer, for you guys. So a really, really good thing that they did was they created this thing called cap gap relief. And what cap gap is if you file an H-1B on April 1st, and if you're selected, they will automatically extend your F1 status and your OPT employment authorization all the way through September 30th. Oh, sorry, my black is light. So let's just pretend you graduate in June and your OPT starts in July. You file your H-1B next April 1, 2020. Your OPT ends July 2020. You've got a gap between July 2020 and October 1st. By filing your H-1B, you get cap gap, which automatically extends your F1 and your OPT all the way through September 30th if you are selected. Now, if you are in one of these weird situations where your OPT is expiring, but you don't know yet if you were selected, you can still use cap gap until you get your rejected package back. So sometimes you might be able to squeeze in another month of OPT just because you don't know. All right, now, why did I say December grad is not such a good thing? In order to qualify for cap gap, your OPT OPT must be valid on April 1st. Traditionally, December grads, your OPT is usually done by February, right? So then you're not going to get the full cap gap. When I say full cap gap, if you're in your 60-day grace period on April 1st, you will get the status extension, so you can stay and wait it out, but you will not have employment authorization. So if you haven't graduated yet, I strongly encourage you to maybe think about graduating at a traditional time, unless you have STEM OPT. If you have STEM OPT, then fine, graduate in December, right? You had a question, you had a question?
Oh yeah, for nonprofits, if you make a sponsor, like how do you know if they're qualified for the cap exemption?
Okay, so I took that slide out. So there's a whole category of H-1Bs called cap exempt, H-1Bs for universities. Also for nonprofit research and nonprofits that are affiliated with universities, for example, Doheny Eye Institute is affiliated with USC, and then for nonprofit research entities. So it can't just be nonprofit, it has to be nonprofit and research. Usually when you're looking at the website, you can tell from the mission statement if they're engaged in research. Often there's going to be white papers and publications and things like that. If you can't tell, then usually you have to go and look at the corporate documents when they set up, and that gets a little bit trickier. But if you are going to go work for a cap exempt organization, there's no cap gap, because technically they can file any time of the year. So you guys, when you're thinking about option, your plan B and your plan C and your plan D, which you need to have because things are crazy in the immigration world, you do want to think about, look, whether it's your startup, if it's not your startup, you have to be looking for jobs the traditional way to do an H-1B. You have to be looking at jobs, but you can't bank on private industry and the lottery. You want to be thinking about looking for jobs at universities because those are cap exempt. You want to think about jobs going global, going home. You may not want to, but something to think about. Yeah.
With the cap exempt organizations, could you found your own nonprofit or something?
The problem with that is, technically you could found your own nonprofit, but you have to show that you have a history of funding and research, which is hard to do.
Okay.
So it may be a few years before you can use it for an H-1B. Yeah.
I also realized you get a cap exempt H-1B, do you have to
I'm sorry, will you say that louder?
So once you get a cap exempt H-1B, could you qualify for cap exemption for the next H-1Bs if you change employer, but they're no longer
So yeah, the problem is if you start off with a cap exempt H-1B at a university and then you want to go into private industry, you have to go through lottery. Yeah.
Now, OPT and Europeans, next February is not STEM, so.
It's
if I
not
get-
STEM.
No. If I get selected, I should leave my.
Did you file an H-1B this year?
No, I haven't filed it.
So the tough thing for you is you may find an employer that will sponsor you for next year, but
Yeah.
the problem is, are they going to wait for you between February and October because you won't be able to work? Yeah. Someone else have a question? Yeah.
So you always need a company to file the H-1B for you?
You always need a company. There's no such thing as self-petitioning for, well, I'll kind of come to that in a sec. Okay, so, still talking about H-1Bs. I did want to spend a few minutes just talking about the myths or the lies about H-1Bs, that this is where people will say, oh, you can't do this because, and it's not necessarily true. So number one, some people will say to you, oh, you can't file an H-1B for a small company or a startup. I'm going to say not true. Why? When immigration looks at your H-1B, they care about two things. Number one, is the company financially viable? And number two, are you working in a professional or specialty occupation? So with number one, it's all about funding. Whether you're a small company or a startup, when I say small, I'm talking about 5 to 10 people. All right, I'm not talking about 50 people. That's plenty for an H-1B. I'm talking about small. All right, so let's start with startups first. Startups, as long as you're financially viable, because what they care about is can the company pay your prevailing wage, and can the company cover operational costs? So if your startup has VC funding or angel funding, or it just has a ton of, some rich investor who's invested in you, and you can show financial viability, that's good. Same with small companies. I have a ton of, little boutique companies who make $6 to $10 million a year with under 10 people. That's financial viability, that's fine. Right, so That's one side of it. The flip side of it is they want to make sure that you are working in a professional occupation, which means that's where numbers can hurt you. So you want to be able to show that there's enough of a structure where you are spending the majority of your time doing professional occupation work. Right? The thing about small companies and startups is everyone pitches in to help answer the phone and do FedExes and fetch coffee and the admin stuff. You do not want to be doing the admin stuff. And you want to be able to show that there's either interns or an admin assistant or receptionist who is doing all that admin stuff so that the immigration can come back and say, there's not enough organizational structure, you must be doing administrative stuff as well as your H-1B professional occupation work. All right, so small companies and startups, you can file an H-1B as long as you've got financial viability and you can show that there's some structure. Number 2, you will find some employers who say to you, oh, I've heard it's so hard to do an H-1B because I have to do newspaper ads and recruitment and I don't have money or time to deal with that. Right? There is absolutely no requirement for recruitment on an H-1B. So as long as the company is willing to sponsor you for offer you a job, sponsor you for the H-1B, pay your training fee, that's really all it takes. All right, there's no recruitment requirement. Number 3, some people will say to you, oh, there's no more H-1Bs this year, lottery's gone, you cannot change jobs. So another takeaway from today, if you are lucky enough to get selected in H-1B lottery, you have a number. All right, and like this girl here, the Canadian here in the back, she has an H-1B number, right? So that means that once you have your H-1B, if you want to change jobs, assuming it's private industry, there's something called H-1B portability, which means that you can port or you can transfer your H-1B and you can start working as soon as your H-1B is filed. You don't have to pay premium processing and get it approved before you start. You can start as soon as it's filed. All right, so don't let someone say to you, oh, there's no more H-1Bs this year, they just finished running lottery, because you have an H-1B number already. Right? The only time that doesn't apply is if you went to a university and you never went through lottery, because then you do have to go through lottery. That's if you go the traditional path, but knowing about the H-1B is also important. So what if you do want to do your own startup and you don't qualify for an E, investor visa? Can you sponsor yourself for an H-1B? So technically, USCIS prohibits self-sponsorship, which means it can't be Joe Walsh sponsoring Joe Walsh. All right? But you can set up a corporate entity, whether it's a corporation or limited liability company. You can set up a separate corporate entity because it has its own identity to sponsor you for your H-1B. But if you do that, there are some conditions. Number 1, you can only have a minority interest in the company because you have to be treated as an employee. And when immigration looks at you, whether you're an employee or not, they want to know, can you be fired from your job? All right, so if you have majority ownership, you can't, no one's going to push you out. So minority interest is what they look at. Are you an employee, which means you have to be an employee. What could you do around it? So the less than 50%. If you own more than 50%, you could set up a board of directors and you report to the board, and the board can terminate you. It gets a little bit trickier because there are some, there's fiduciary duties for the board and things like that. So not everyone will want to be a board member on your board, so that gets complicated. But in theory, you could. Now, if you end up doing an H-1B, the big downside is you're not going to be able to, you won't be able to use your company to sponsor yourself for a green card, the traditional way, right? There might be other ways to do a green card, but it could be a risky strategy because, you only have 6 years on an H-1B and then what, right? You really want to start a green card at some point. Now, what are the other challenges if you want to try and sponsor yourself? Financial viability is one of them, so maybe you've got funding, so that won't be an issue. We talked about you spending, the majority of your time working in a professional occupation. One of the biggest challenge, though, is usually if you're a founder or co-founder, usually it means your prevailing wage is going to be as a CEO, a COO, some sort of management position, which means right off the bat, your prevailing wage is going to be high, right? Which, as a startup, you want it to be blood, sweat, and tears. You don't want to be paying yourself a big fat salary. And if you're trying to attract investors for funding, they don't want to see you paying yourself a big fat salary. So there are some practical challenges you're going to have. And then it goes back to the same thing. Don't cut corners. Don't call yourself a market research analyst if you're not. Don't say you're part-time because when you're really full-time. All right, because remember, investigators will come and you don't want to go to jail or you don't want to get deported. Any questions? No. All right, spouses, if you're married, which hardly anyone in the room was, they can go to school. If your H4 spouse wants to work, they usually have to get their own work visa unless you're Chinese or Indian. If you're Chinese or Indian, if you started a green card, you may be able to get a work permit as an H4, but it's likely to disappear relatively soon. What if you miss out on the H1B or the E and your OPT's out, you're about to expire? What can you do? We're going to talk about some of the alternatives. We are also going to, what are your options? If you are working for a company, if you're lucky enough where the company has an office abroad, you could go and work with the office abroad and try for an H1B the following year. Maybe if you're a manager and executive, maybe you can do an L1 visa, which is a different kind of visa. If you are lucky enough to be in a position where you don't really have to be in an office, the work is, you can do it remotely. If you want to go home and sit in the comfort of your parents' home where it's free laundry and free food, you can do that. Or on a beach somewhere, you can work remotely. Can you come in on a B1, B2, which is your visitor visa, or your B1 or ESTA? Be very, very careful. Coming in as a visitor or for business, you can come in for meetings, for contract negotiations, for conferences. It doesn't mean you can come in for 6 months on a B1 and work. All right, that's unauthorized employment. You cannot do that. The big one, though, is going back to school. How many of your friends who missed out on H1B lottery and have gone back to school to either a master's or PhD program and they've gone back to work on day one on CPT? One person. Who's not even a foreign national, correct?
Yeah, I just made friends with some.
Okay, so just to give you context, in case, so what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years with this H1B madness, right? There are so many people who've missed out on H1Bs. So there are some, whether you want to call it entrepreneurs or not, there are a lot of pop-up schools that have popped up offering these programs where you can basically do CPT from day one. Remember I talked about CPT earlier, curricular practical training, usually allows you to work during school. Now, as a general rule, you can only do CPT after you've completed one academic year, your first year, right, with exceptions. So what a lot of these pop-up schools have done is they found the exceptions and they've created these programs where you're doing a full-time internship. There are some of these programs, it's a 4-year PhD, CPT from day one, you work your entire 4 years. So it's basically I'm gonna call it a scam to basically put you back to work on day one. You're basically working and earning and paying school, and you never have to set foot on campus. If it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. So what's kind of happening, why I say it's a little bit of a scam, if you're gonna do this, make sure you do it with a school you've heard of before that's established. Don't go with a school that just popped up, a year ago, 2 years ago, because USCIS has started to investigate some of these schools. They're called CPT mills, and they've closed down 3 or 4 already. And a really interesting thing that happened to me the other day is I met with a potential client who actually got married, who had actually fallen out of status, gotten married. But when he filed his green card application, he got a request for evidence, we call them RFEs, asking him to explain all the different schools he'd been to, and he'd been to some of these CPT mills, and he'd been to some of these schools in K-Town where you basically pay tuition but you never go to school, right? They're all scams. And I've never seen that before. So you want to talk about what it's all enforcement with the Trump administration, and you don't know what's going to come back and haunt you in a couple of years or in 5 years. So just be very, very careful about this whole thing about going back to school to do an MBA or PhD and full-time CPT, all right? Because you don't want to have the school closed down and then you're left with nothing. All right, so those, I'm going to depress, by the time we're done today, you might be a little bit depressed, but it's good because it's Friday afternoon and you can all go get a drink, if you drink. Okay, so those are some of your immediate options. What else are your options, especially if you want to do a startup? All right, there is also something called an O1. It's an alien of extraordinary ability. Look, it may not be you today, but it might be you later on. But the technical name is alien of extraordinary ability. You do, if you can show that you have achieved a certain level of success in your field. Maybe more common if you go on to do a PhD and maybe you've published and you've spoken at conferences and you've engaged in peer review activity, if you've gone into sort of more academia, but if you've set up a startup and your startup is kind of hot and you're getting quoted and you're being interviewed in mainstream media outlets, or you're being quoted and you're asked to speak at trade shows and things, you've gotten some awards, that could also be an O1. So don't kind of just, again, may not be today, but something to have in the back of your mind as you get more successful. All right, and some of you may go on to do an MBA or a PhD, and you may start a startup on the side, and after 3 years on STEM OPT, maybe you'll have press, maybe you have done really well. So I've left it in there. There's an info sheet as well, but the ones in yellow are pretty much the things that they tend to look for, which is all about publications or mainstream media. Press is king when you file these O1s. All right, let's skip that one. Why would you do an O1? Same thing, you can set up a corporate entity. You can use that entity to sponsor you. It is a 3-year visa, renewable indefinitely. There's no quota, which means you can do it any time of the year. Why would you consider it? Maybe because there's no e-visa for you. Maybe the H-1B doesn't really work. No one here is a J, so I'm just going to skip that. But that's one reason to do it. And then, this is what I referred to earlier. If the startup may not be viable for now from an immigration standpoint, you may have the vision, you may have the idea, you may really, really want to do it, but you may find that practically there's no way you can do it with the appropriate visa, and you don't want to be doing it with, by working without permission. Suck it up, as in go find an employer that's going to sponsor you, do a green card. If you're not Chinese or Indian, you can probably do your green card in 1.5 to 2 years. I know it's a compromise, but spend that time, get your green card. Green card means freedom. After that, you can be an entrepreneur, unless you're Chinese or Indian. Sorry. Because my Chinese and Indian friends, you know that you have super long backlogs and it takes a long time to get a green card. All right. Now, the suck it up means, what we talked about the H-1B. We talked about doing it, but the challenge is you cannot do your startup on the side. For Canadians and Mexicans, one of your options is, there's five lucky countries with free trade agreements with the U.S. Canada and Mexico have TN NAFTA visas. Right. Are there any Australians in the room? No. I know we have a Singaporean, so that's another treaty. And then last one, Chile. 5 lucky countries with free trade agreements, so some nice options instead of the H. The L1 we didn't really talk about. I'm just going to mention it really quickly. Also a suck it option, especially if you're Chinese or Indian. So this is where maybe you do work for a big company, maybe they send you abroad to work at one of their offices overseas. It doesn't have to be in your home country. It can be the London or the Sydney or the Frankfurt or the Bahamas office. If you go and work for a big multinational company 1 year outside of the US as a manager and executive, they can transfer you back in on an L1 visa, and they can sponsor you for a fast-track green card. Right? Look, it applies to everyone, but for Chinese and Indians, it gives you a way for EB1, which is the fast-track green card, so something to think about. All right, so, you can't even see my unhappy face. For years, so I've been doing this 20 years, and for many, many years, we all talked about an entrepreneur parole. right, for entrepreneurs, because the E2 is very old-fashioned. You know, if you don't have your own money to invest and it's coming from other investors who are not from your country, it's complicated. And what are those no treat? So everyone was talking about an entrepreneur parole, a visa for years. And President Obama, 3 days before he left office, gave us an entrepreneur visa. And like immigration, I mean, everyone was like super excited. I work with a lot of MBAs, and everyone was so excited. And then Trump came into office, and guess what? He's rescinding it. All right, so right now, technically, the immigration has applications, but they're not even adjudicating them. So I just wanted to mention it just in case, you know, because this is the perfect situation where people will say to you, oh, but I heard there's an entrepreneur visa. Why doesn't TL know about it? Or why aren't you doing this? Why aren't we doing it? Because they're going to rescind it. And they're not even adjudicating things. So I'm just mentioning it so you know it's done. All right, any questions on work visas before I start talking about green cards? No, because it's so comprehensive, you have no questions. All right, so green cards. Different ways to get green cards. All right, if your goal is to stay, that's what you want to do. How many of you know about green card lottery? How many of you done green card lottery? 3 people? Okay. The US government has a green card lottery. They give away 50,000 green cards, which is not a lot. About 10 million people apply. But why do you want to do it? You want to do it because it's free. It takes you about 10 minutes to do it. You can only register in the month of October, and then usually the first weekend in November. Once you actually submit your application, it's all online. So if you have found a website that wants to charge you money for it, you're at the wrong place. All right, seriously, 10 minutes over a glass of wine, a cup of coffee, beer, whatever, just do it religiously every year because you never know. But having said that, not everyone is eligible to participate. Right, so the way green cards work is green cards are based on your country of birth, not your citizenship. So if you're Chinese and you have a Canadian passport, or you're Indian and you have a Canadian passport, your country of birth governs. So what they do for a green card lottery is if you are from a country with one of the highest number of immigrants moving to the US, they kick you out of the lottery. Right, so all the countries you've got up here, it's basically India, China, Canada, Mexico, Korea, but Hong Kong, someone was from Hong Kong. My person from Hong Kong can do green card lottery. You are not allowed to do lottery if you're born in one of those countries. Right, but so if you were not born in one of those countries, you should be doing it religiously every year. If you are married and your spouse can do it, usually when I do these workshops, I always have like an Indian who was born in UAE or somewhere. That's wonderful. Or there's a spouse who was born in a country that's allowed to do lottery. That's great because then you can do lottery and it helps you for green cards generally. Somebody had a hand up. Yeah.
A good question. So, my like citizenship is like in United Kingdom, but I was born in Hong Kong, so because I have a dual. So
You are considered Hong Kong for country of birth. You can do lottery, and you would use Hong Kong for green card purposes. So yay, that's a good one. All right, so that's lottery. What else is there? There is the life happens to you when you live in the US. All right, some people are giggling already. So some of you, maybe undergrads, or maybe you did your undergrad here and now you're in grad school, or you're going to spend the next couple of years here. Life happens to you, which means if you are in a serious relationship with a US citizen, not a green card holder, US citizen, you probably know it can lead to a green card fairly quickly. I say serious relationship with a US citizen, which means has to be the right time, the right place. Don't ever let a friend help you out. Don't ever pay anyone to do it. But if you do get married to a US citizen, it can lead to a green card very quickly. I sometimes have clients who say to me, oh yeah, I'm getting married to my boyfriend, girlfriend, who's a US citizen next year, but I want to do a green card my way. I want to do it through employer. I want to do it on my own. I don't want to be dependent on them. I'm going to tell you, swallow your pride, get married, and file your green card through your spouse. All right? Don't try and do it, oh, I want to do, my employer's going to sponsor me. I sometimes have clients who say to me, oh, I want to do the green card as an alien of extraordinary ability. And I'm kind of like, look, your green card's your green card. You know, there are very, very few people in the world. It's not like they print on your green card, alien of extraordinary ability, so you have bragging rights, okay? It's the green card. So swallow your pride. Now, since there were only a handful of people who said they were married, you guys should all be dating. Get on it. Now, this is the part where I share too much information with you, and we're going to share Harsh and Ada's information too, but long time ago, my story is I'm originally from Malaysia. I went to high school, university in Australia, in Sydney. My final year of Sydney Uni, I did an exchange abroad program, got an F1 for a year to that other school over in Westwood. All right. So I finished out my senior year at UCLA. I say that very quietly. And it was kind of interesting. And then, you know, I actually had 2 F1s. Then I went to grad school in Boston to law school. All right, so I've been through the OPT panic. What am I going to do? But the interesting, so my advice to all of you, little old advice. So when I first came out to LA, it was still a little bit of culture shock, even though I came from Australia. I'm ethnically Chinese. So some of you may relate. Look, immigrant parents, you go out, your parents want to know, first of all, is he Chinese? Is he a doctor or a lawyer? It's like you go down the list, right? Okay. And some of you can relate to that, but Asian parents. All right, so, but it was interesting because then I would come back from a date and my friends in the dorm would be sort of say to me, well, what kind of car does he drive? And I'd be like, oh, so LA, come on. All right, so for all of you, because you're all single, when you're dating, what's your number 1 question? Are you a U.S. citizen? Remember, I say that as a joke, but remember, just it has to be for all the right reasons, right time, right person, all of that. All right. If you do get married to a U.S. citizen, usually you'll get what we call a combo card, which is a combined work permit and travel document, usually within 3 to 5 months, where it's unrestricted employment. You go to your interview. Your interview is, you know, they want to make sure you got married for all the right reasons, but it's not like the movies where they ask super intense questions. And you can get your green card that way. Now, some of you may have a baby in the U.S., which having a baby in the U.S. is wonderful, but your baby has to be 21 before they can sponsor you, so it's not really going to help you. All right? Now, there are other family-based categories as well. The 2 in yellow are really the most common ones. I kind of make jokes about if you're dating, they have to be a U.S. citizen, not a green card holder. If they're a green card holder, it's a different family category, and there are lengthy backlogs, so it's probably going to take 3 to 5 years. And while you're waiting for your green card, you need to maintain your underlying status, which means you need to have an H-1B or F1 or O1 or something, because when you marry a U.S. citizen and file, it doesn't give you anything until 3 or 4 years into the process. Let me finish one thing. Some of you may have a sibling, right? You may have a brother or sister who becomes a U.S. citizen and you think, wow, I'm all set. I can have my brother or sister sponsor me. Those cases are closer to a 15, 20-year wait. So chances are you're going to get your green card through employment or through credible success through your startup before you rely on your sibling. Yeah.
Say I am doing employment-based green card, and it will take me like 3 years, but I have that I can exactly
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
so I don't have to worry about. In that case, if I found a sponsor, green card sponsor, I don't have to worry about
As long as you have your, as long as your OPT will take you through it. So when you file your green card application at some point, we're going to talk about, at some point you're going to get, everyone gets this combo card, combined work permit and travel document. So you want to make sure that you have your combo card in place before your OPT expires. Otherwise, you will be an H-1B or a TN or something. Or you go back to school and wait. All right, so there's family-based, there's lottery, yeah.
Quick question about family based. Are those backlogs like worldwide or does that vary by country?
It varies by, well, it's both. So what happens with green cards for employment-based and family-based is every country gets a certain percentage. For employment-based, every country gets 7%. So the reason China and India have such long backlogs, if you think about it, is 7% for a country what you'll find is there are certain countries, China, India, Philippines, Mexico, tend to have longer backlogs. And sometimes other countries don't have backlogs, so yeah.
Yeah. I asked because my dad is an immigrant. Apparently, all of his siblings and his parents have green cards they got somehow through him, but
Parents are immediate relative.
okay.
So spouse, minor child, is immediate relative, and then if you're a U.S. citizen, you can sponsor your parents. That's also
My
immediate
dad's
relative.
now a citizen.
That's what Melania Trump did for her parents, but we don't like chain migration apparently.
It's funny when you said suck it up because that's what my dad had to do.
Suck it up, and you went to work for an employer.
No, to get the green card through marriage because he was already applying.
Hey! I'm sure he loved her.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's your mom, right?
Yeah.
You shouldn't say suck it up. I meant suck it up and work for an employer.
Suck up his pride. Oh, white.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we talked about family-based, we talked about green card lottery. Everything else is going to be employment-based, right? We call them EBs. EB stands for employment-based. There's 5 categories. So there's EB1, EB2, EB3, EB4, EB5. There's 2 kinds of green cards where you can self-petition. So one of them is this alien of extraordinary ability. It's like the green card version of the O1. So again, it might not be you today, but if you are going into academia, you want to, you're going to be publishing, you're going to be speaking, you're going to be engaged in peer review activity. If you go into private industry, try and do media coverage, all right? Because again, any sort of media is good. If you're published, if you're writing articles, also speaking at industry events, those are all good things for an EB1. Yeah.
What if you have an O1 in the entertainment industry?
You see, I skipped over my O1. So if you have there's 2 kinds of O1s. There's an O1 for anyone in science, business, athletics, education, which is a higher standard where you have to show you are considered one of the top in your field. There's also an O1 for people in arts and entertainment, which is a lower standard. So you can do, and when I say lower standard, so science, education, business, you have to show you're one of the top people in your field. Extraordinary for arts and entertainment is substantially above the norm. All right, so I do a lot of O1s for visual effects artists and graphic designers and architects. Those are, you do it under the lowest standard. Now, when you're looking at the green card though, how does it transition? If you got an O1 in the sciences, business, education, it's a really nice stepping stone to the green card because it's the same standard. I will tell you though, so it's nice to be able to wave the O1 in the office's face and say, hey, I got an O1 under the higher standard, therefore you should approve my green card like that. I will tell you in practice it doesn't happen quite that way. They're a little more generous sometimes with the marginal O1 for business and under the business standard and science standard, and sometimes they're a little bit tougher on the green card even though you already have an O1. Now, having an O1 in arts and entertainment, it's a much bigger step to get to a green card because you can't wave it in the office's face and say, hey, I have an O1 as an architect or graphic designer, because they're going to say, well, that standard's much lower. Yeah.
Will it be basically like recently esports was a big build up, so basically like for esports industry players are basically applying for this one or the lower standard one or instead of this?
So the it's considered a sport under immigration, so it's actually under the higher standard. But usually, if you're pretty successful, you're going to have you're going to be ranked, you're going to have press, and so usually, if you're any good, the O1's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
So if you have an O1, what benefits do you get from upgrading to a green card?
So an O1, you're still tied to an employer, usually, unless you have an agent or a manager because you're in arts or in entertainment, which means you're tied to the employer and you're going to have to keep renewing. Green card is freedom. Once you get your green card, you can work anywhere you want, for anyone you want. You don't have to work. That's really it. Right, so you're not beholden to anyone. The thing about being on a visa is what if you get laid off? Okay, so there's EB1s. We talked about extraordinary ability. What I don't have up there though is if you go into academia, there's also something called an outstanding professor or researcher. And then remember that L1 multinational executive manager visa, there's also an EB1 there. If you go abroad for a year and then come back, that's fast track green card. Then we have what we call EB2s. EB2 is also another self-petition where it's a much lower standard. If you can show that whatever you are doing is in the national interest of the US, there's a 3-part test under this one case. So usually you have to show that whatever you're doing has substantial merit and national importance. Usually, if whatever field you're in, you can usually find a White House report or something, or a National Science Foundation report, or something to say that your industry is important, unless you're working in climate change. Climate change scientists have a hard time now. Number 2, that you are well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor. So this is where if you've had some success, whether you've been speaking or publishing or creating jobs, you might be able to do that. And then number 3, on balance, it's beneficial for the US to waive the requirements of a labor certification. What does that all mean? The traditional way for most people to get a green card is for the company to sponsor them. And when you do that green card, the company does have to go through advertising and recruitment. All right, so that's where that whole advertising recruitment concept comes in. It gets kind of bled into the H-1B, but there's no recruitment required from H-1B. It's a green card thing. So traditionally, for most people, if your employer sponsors you, they have to recruit to show they can't find a minimally qualified US worker. So this last thing for the national interest waiver, or NIW, the idea is that you're so good, you're so successful, that it'd be stupid to have to try and replace you with a minimally qualified US worker. All right, so NIWs. Look, it's easier if you're in the sciences, obviously, because you're publishing, you're speaking, all of that. But you can do a lot of business cases. So this is where if you have a startup and your startup is doing pretty well, you have some funding, you're generating some media coverage about your startup, maybe you're doing some interviews and getting quoted, and you've started to create jobs, NIW might also be the way. All right, now NIW is EB2, which, I'm sorry my Indian and Chinese friends, you can file it, but you're in for a long, long wait as well. So usually if you're Indian, you kind of want to be going for EB1. All right, so I'm going to mention this quick. When you're filing a green card application under the NIW or EB1, usually there's 2 application phases. The first one is where you file something called an I-140. It's an immigrant petition. It says you want to immigrate, the company's sponsoring you, or you're self-petitioning. That's the hard part. The second application that's filed is something called an adjustment of status application, or an I-485. It will adjust your status from your H-1B to green card, O-1 to green card, F-1 STEM OPT to green card. Now, usually when you file, in most situations you can file these 2 applications together unless there are backlogs. And when you file it, as part of the application, you get something called a combo card, which is this combined work permit and travel document. Right? Comes as part of the process. It's not a good sign, a bad sign. It's just part of the process. So if you are going through this and you're trying to do it while you're on STEM OPT, you want to have your combo card. You want to have filed your I-140 and your 485 and have your combo card in place before your OPT expires, which is very doable unless you're Chinese or Indian, because what happens is if you're Chinese or Indian, you may know you get stuck. You get stuck at the I-485 part. You can't file it. All right, why does that happen? I'm just gonna scoot ahead. Actually, I can hold that thought. Why does, this is the perm application that I was talking about. This is what most people will go through where the company's has to advertise and recruit. All right, so if you do a perm application, there's one extra step at the very beginning where you have to submit your perm application to the Department of Labor after all of the advertising and recruitment, and then you go to this step 2 and 3, which is your I-140 and your 485. Now, when I was saying this thing about for Indians and Chinese, you cannot file your adjustment of status application until your priority date is current. What does that mean? Every month, there's something called a visa bulletin which comes out, and you'll see this is from March, and you'll see down the left column it says first, second, third. First is EB1, second is EB2, third, is EB3. And you'll see it goes across horizontally. You'll see all countries, and then China, and then you'll see India, Mexico, Philippines, right? It goes across. So EB1 has those dates. So this is the really weird thing that's happened. Let's just do EB2 real quick. So if you do look at EB2, look at China, it says January 1st, 2016. And look at India, it says 9th of April, 2009. If you are filing a perm application through your employer and you file it today is April 5, right? April 5th, 2019. Your filing date is like your priority date. So So you have to wait for the visa bulletin to come out if you're Indian, and it has to show April 5, 2019 before you can file your I-45 adjustment application. This is now stuck on April 2009. Right now, this comes out every month. Some months, those dates don't move. Some months they retrogress, which means they go backwards. And some months they go to, it'll say U, which means unavailable, which means they hit all the numbers for the fiscal year and it doesn't move. Right, China is not so bad, but January 2016 you'll see it's still not great, there's a wait. Now, traditionally EB1 is the fast track category. And it still is, but for the first time in 20 years, you'll see EB1, it says there's dates on all of them. Usually EB1 says C, which means current, which means you can file your I-140-45 anytime. And this is the first time in 20 years that EB1 is backlogged across. And it's actually been backlogged since the beginning of this year, since October. But if you are Chinese or Indian, it's still much faster than going the traditional EB2 or EB3 route. All right. So, Ade gave me permission to use both. I don't know if he mentioned which case studies. How many people are from your class are still here? Most. So, a couple of case studies. On the left, you see Harsh, who, and this is where, you know, it's all about timing sometimes. It can be about luck, and sometimes it can be about bad luck. So you have Harsh on the left, PhD, filed an EB1. He was on F1, STEM OPT, started his own company, right? Transitioned from, obviously the company did quite well, transitioned from the STEM OPT to an O1. This is a few years ago. And then we filed an EB1A, so that's the name of extraordinability, and we were able to say, look, you gave him the O1, therefore you should give him the EB1. He premium processed it, got his, so that's November 2016. He got his public card pretty quickly, so that gave him unrestricted employment and travel authorization. And his adjustment got approved in May 2017. Super fast track. That's like the perfect case that went really, really well. Right? EB1s are backlog now, so you wouldn't be able to file the adjustment. And now one of the things they do is you have to go in for it. So all of this happened by May. So Harsh never went in for an interview, but now there's mandatory interviews for everyone. That's delaying things even more. So even the EB1 nowadays will probably take about 15 to 18 months, so about a year and a half, which is still fast track. Ade on the right, also F1 OPT. Filed an H1B 2015, missed out on lottery. Got selected, we did mini celebration in 2016. And then he got an RFE, which is request for evidence. And the officer denied his H1B. So we appealed it. The appeal was also denied in February. By then, the company that they co-founded was doing pretty well. So we put together an NIW to show, look, this company has grown. So remember the national interest waiver to show this company has grown, is creating jobs. They have X amount of funding. They've already, you know, they have clients already. They're generating revenues. He had spoken at industry conferences. There was media coverage. And I think you guys also worked to get the media coverage. All right. So I thought we had a pretty strong case that we put together. Then we got an RFE. But we put together, you know, some new evidence, some more letters on the RFE. It still took them another 10 months. So we got the RFE January 2018, and it finally got approved in November 2018. So this is where sometimes luck, or you know, whether it's good or bad, but you have to persevere. Sometimes it's just like how much longer it took to get to a green card. But that's just two examples or two case studies. I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
Yeah, so
It's frustrating. You can ask Ade how frustrating and painful it was.
so what Theo skipped was that when the H1B got denied, I actually had to go back to school. And so I went to UCLA and I got a certificate there, and I quit the company too because I couldn't work while I was a student, and then I had to come back as an intern. So that was not a fun experience, but yeah.
I mean, regardless of silver lining, now he has a certificate in finance, which we cite as an experience. That's it. So.
All right.
But not fun. Also not fun as a startup within or an employer. So yeah.
And if you are, you know, even for the Americans or the US citizens in here, you know, if you are starting up a company, these assign, and you know, if you are in tech, you are going to be hiring foreign nationals because the reality is that there aren't enough American kids graduating with STEM degrees, right? So if that's what you're hiring, you are going to have to hire foreign nationals and go through the H-1B or green card or something. And at some point too, as an employer, you have to decide if you want to be immigrant friendly and sponsor. I mean, look, there are companies that just say, I'm sorry, there's too much trouble, I only want to hire Americans, but it limits your pool of potential hires, right? So you want to, either you could be that employer that's 120% supportive or 200% supportive, or you put it out there that you don't sponsor. But you will run into these issues if you are in that industry. Okay, before you're all going to get depressed now. So, life under Trump. I like that slide. So first of all, so when Trump first came, when he won in 2016, a lot of immigration lawyers, like myself, thought, okay, he's a lot of rhetoric, it's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, but you know, you kind of just grin and bear it. You know, for any major change to happen, he's going to have to get legislation passed through Congress, which means the Senate and the House have to agree on something, and they can't agree on anything. So it's going to be okay. We were all so wrong. So they were really, the Trump administration has been brilliant and sneaky, but it's really depressing because I honestly don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years, because I think entrepreneurs are just not going to want to come to the US, and I don't know if the US is going to be as cutting edge as it was. But what they did, number one thing that they did was, you may remember, Buy American, Hire American, this is April of 2017. So through an executive order, what they've pretty much done is, instead of changing the law, they're rulemaking through adjudication. So basically, they're changing everything by denying cases or issuing more RFPs. They're just making it so hard that what's happening is employers are just being very reluctant to sponsor, right? Because it's so hard, the number of hoops to jump through. You know, I used to get 10 approvals a day, now I get 10 RFPs a day. And we saw a 50% increase in RFPs last year, which again, you know, instead of getting 10 approvals, you get 10 RFPs, like you want to tear your hair out, right? Now, so 2 years ago when we started getting them, we responded and I got all of mine approved. And then last year, it's like they ratcheted it up another notch. And now, I mean, and this last year, from basically this last fiscal year, 2018 lottery cases, everyone's getting denials. We're getting denials on cases that I would never have thought twice about, but the denials are not consistent. You know, the perfect example, I have this boutique investment banking company. You know, we probably filed about 3 dozen H-1Bs for investment bankers, which I would never have thought, come on, you can't tell me that's a job you can do without a bachelor's degree in business admin or econ or math or statistics, right? So first half of our cases got approved very early on in May or June of last year, and I had about 2 dozen that was still pending in September. And I think what happened in September, because remember, the start date is supposed to be October 1st, right? And everyone who's on CAP-GAP needs to start October 1st or they have to go off payroll. And so I think immigration had thousands of cases still pending, and they started issuing RFEs, just like crazy. So I had like half of those cases that I RFEs. We responded to them all. They all got approved except for one. Now, is there anything different about this one investment banker against my other? Nothing. But unluckily for the guy, it was just a different officer, and it got denied. So a lot of that is also happening, which I know is not comforting to you, but you also need to know what's going on, right? So what are they picking on with H-1Bs? Wages. If you're an entry-level wage, they don't like it. There are certain occupations where they're coming back now and saying, well, you know, they use a certain guidebook where if you say, oh, the job requires a degree in engineering. So if you have an electrical engineering degree, but you're a software engineer, they're saying it doesn't really make sense. I mean, you can make it make sense, and a lot of it's very common, but they're starting to question all sorts of things like that. And what's also happening is a lot of people who've been here for many, many years, their fourth or their fifth H-1B, they're getting denied. And it's creating chaos and uncertainty throughout. So it's all a little depressing. L1's also, but the whole idea with Baja is it really is starting to make employers think twice about sponsoring. Right. So this year was kind of interesting. We always start preparing our H-1Bs January, February. All right, I don't like to, my cutoff date is first week of March. If we haven't started by the first week of March, that's like, it's pushing it. It's tough. This year, the majority of my companies sat, they couldn't, like, they were just indecisive, and we started all our H-1Bs in March, which is insane. All right, I hate doing that, but I think ultimately they still filed, but it took them a long time to decide to actually commit. Somebody had a question?
I was wondering, so some majors have accreditation, which is like assurance of quality. So like our like your majors got with accreditation. It's like I know that USC's CS major, regular CS major is has accreditation, but like some like CS majors with some other combinations like business or like gaming or whatever, I don't think those majors have that. I don't know if it matters when it comes to applying.
So what we've done the last couple of years now is if your degree, so to sort of make it simple, there's a Department of Labor handbook called the Occupational Outlook, it's OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook. And OOH is online and it has all these occupations there, and it tells you, okay, if you want to become a software engineer, this is how you become one, and it'll say you need to, most employers require a bachelor's degree in, in computer science or something like that. So USCIS has started using this OOH as a Bible. So when you file an H-1B, they look at OOH, but the problem with the OOH is it's outdated. It's very 20th century. Half of the tech jobs nowadays aren't even listed, right? They're all listed, and so what happens is they're listed under this other computer occupations. You use the other computer occupations, it's a guaranteed RF fee. And this is where USCIS is just, there's no common sense in what they are thinking. So what we've started to do is we have all of our clients give us 3 pages of every class they've taken that's relevant to the job. And we have, I'm gonna tell you, everyone hates it, and they all send their questionnaires back and they leave it blank, and we go back and it's like, you need to fill this out to tell us what classes you took and why it's important. So if you are going on to an H-1B, please do that for your lawyer. Because it's really helpful, because then you can, because immigration can't question how your degree is relevant, even if you don't have that very specific degree. So one of the stupid things they're doing now is sometimes employers just kind of, your letter you just say, requires a degree in engineering, and they're coming back saying, well, engineering can be mechanical or electrical or civil, there's all these engineering degrees, therefore your position must not be a specialty occupation. It's like very nonsensical reasoning, but that's what we're seeing. That's just the period that we live in. All right, so that's H's. What the Trump administration has also done, so instead of changing the legal framework, they've just issued a flurry of guidance memos, executive orders. So they're changing the way they adjudicate cases and the interpretation of policy. All right, so some of them up there, I'm not going to go through all of them, but October 2017, anyone who's applying for green card now has to go to an interview. October 2017, I've got up there, revoked the deference memo. So what that used to be is, once you had your H-1B or your L1 or your O1, and you filed your extension, the idea is that immigration would give your approval deference, right? They weren't supposed to re-adjudicate your whole case again unless they sensed that there was some sort of fraud or misrepresentation. It's, basically to be more efficient. So they revoked this deference memo, which is when we started seeing all these RFEs on H-1B extensions. And that's why some of you may have friends who, on their 5th or 6th extension, H-1B extension, is now getting denied. All right, so that was different. But the big one that impacts all of you that I mentioned earlier, August 2018, they issued this unlawful presence memo for F1s and Js. So all the F1s in the room. So if you come in, once you transition to an H-1B, when you come in, they stamp your passport and your I-94, and you're gonna have an actual expiration date. Right now, when you guys enter, they write D/S, right, which means duration of stay, which means as long as you're still in school, you're considered in status. So the rule was when you're D/S, or duration of stay, if you stop going to school or you never leave after your OPT expires, you know, you're not here legally, but you never accrued unlawful presence, which means you never became illegal. If you're an H-1B and you stay past the expiration date, you start to accrue unlawful presence, right, which means you're illegal. Once you accrue 180 days of unlawful presence, which is 6 months, if when you leave the US, you're gonna trigger a 3-year bar, which means you can't come back for 3 years. If you overstay by a year, it becomes a 10-year bar, which means you can't come back for 10 years. So then the problem you have once you trigger unlawful presence, you can stay, but you're not going to be able to get legal because you can't change your status anymore because you're not legal. But if you leave, you're going to trigger the bar, the 3 or 10-year bar, so you're like in this no man's land. So what they did in August last year now, if you're an F1 and you have any sort of status violation, you start to accrue unlawful presence. Now, the old rule used to be that immigration would have to make some sort of finding against you to trigger the unlawful presence. This new thing is, you don't even know half the time if you've triggered it. So this is where, if you have CPT and you're supposed to work 20 hours a week, but you work, one week you work 25 hours and you think you'll just work less the following week, that's a status violation. You could be triggering the unlawful status provision, all right? If you fail to report. So guys, this is where you have to be super diligent. When you guys graduate, when you move, you need to fill out the change of address form with the school as well as with USCIS, right? Because it's big brothers watching. When you go into OPT, you are required to put in your employment information, whether you're volunteering or with an employer. You need to make sure you report every single employer, particularly if you're in STEM OPT, but just everyone, but even more so if you're in STEM OPT, right? You cannot be so this is the perfect example. You cannot be working on your startup or generating revenues on your startup on the side when you're still in F1 and you don't have CPT or OPT. I'm sure no one in the room does this. You cannot be driving for Lyft or Uber or anything in the Airbnb. You don't want to be doing any of that because you are going to get a tax document to file with your taxes showing you earned income. All right, so you cannot do any of that stuff. Casual employment, you cannot be working as a tutor. That's also a common one. No bartending, nothing. You have to do things by the book, or you may trigger this unlawful presence, and you may not even know it. And you may leave, and then you're going to trigger bars, and you may not even know it. And then one day you file for a green card, and the whole thing comes to bite you in the ass. And so it's a little hair. Now, this came out, and everyone has been freaked out. Right? Schools have been freaked out because they just don't know how this is going to be enforced. We don't know. There are certain things where we don't know if they're going to. So, you know, come on. With all of these, with the millions of foreign students in the U.S., and everyone knows that sometimes you guys are not good with reporting requirements. So we don't know how they're going to interpret half of these things. There is a lawsuit that's actually supposed to be anytime now. So it may get, who knows, it may go away, it may not, but you guys have to be really, really careful. Yeah?
I was just wondering, how important is it to not miss things like tax return or international students?
I mean, I don't think that's going to be something that's considered a status violation, but if you're required to file taxes, you should be filing taxes.
Yeah.
Then you're just going to get in trouble with the IRS at some point.
I mean, I know I'm not aware of it for this year, but when I started working back in 2 years ago.
They updated their RFE and NOID memo. A NOID is a notice of intent to deny, and then the RFE remembers to request for evidence. Now, in the past, what would happen is whenever you filed a case, you would either get an RFE or an approval or a NOID. You would rarely get a straight denial. And sometimes, you know, silly things happen where you forget a document. The perfect example, when you guys are applying for OPT, please take advantage of OIS. I think OIS will help you review your application or give you a checklist. Please use it. So in the past, what would happen is you submitted your application for OPT and maybe you forgot to sign your I-20, or maybe your I-20, maybe you were super early and you got your I-20 early and then you sat on it for another 2 months before you filed your OPT. In the past, so your I-20 has to be submitted within 30 days of getting it signed by OIS. All right. In the past, if you submitted it out of the period, they would just issue an RFE. You would submit a new I-20. You would get your OPT. Last year, after they released this memo, like immigration came out with this, PR thing saying, "Oh, we're not going to punish you for innocent mistakes," but what's happening is they're totally punishing everyone for innocent mistakes. So last year, I talked to one of the schools I work with, and they had 3 students apply for OPT. All 3 didn't have their OPT applications checked by OIS. They got their I-20s, so they didn't get new I-20s signed within the 30 days, and they submitted it to immigration. One of them got an RFE for the new one. One of them got an RFE for an updated I-20, submitted it. The other 2 got straight denials. Now, if you have just spent 4 years, and by the time you get your denial, you're outside of your application period to file for OPT. You are done. If you've just spent 4 years here or more, and you were expecting to have 1 year of OPT, and you have just lost it because of a stupid mistake like that, where they could have issued an RFE, you're done. You're gonna have to settle affairs and leave, and you've lost your OPT, which is really, really painful. So in this situation, what happened is the other 2 got denied, the one got approved. The school went back and said, "Hey, but you approved these other 2. Now, for lawyers, Immigration 101 is you never rat out, you never tell them, "Hey, you just approved this case," and you give them the name and the receipt number. You never do that, because they will go pull that case and deny it. So guess what happened to this other student who got his OPT? They sent him a letter revoking his OPT because it came to their attention that he submitted it, that the I-20 was not submitted within the right date. Right, so this is what's happening. So you also want to be super careful because you don't want to lose your period of OPT. Arrests also, we've had a couple of anecdotal reports. I know you're all going to be law-abiding citizens, but an arrest can also lead to a straight denial. So just be careful and cross all your T's, dot your I's, because that's what's happening. So since we're talking about arrests, as I said, I know you're all going to be law-abiding citizens, but stuff happens. First of all, if you guys are going out drinking in the age of Uber and Lyft, nobody should be driving. But a DUI is a DUI for long-term, it's not, if you're applying for a green card, you're still going to get a green card. If you're applying for a visa, you'll still get a visa. But what's happening with DUIs is as soon as you get your DUI, it goes into the DMV record, which is shared with the US embassies around the world. And what's happening is as soon as it happens, you will, within 3 or 4 days, before you even show up in court, you will get an email from the US embassy that issued your visa revoking your visa. Right? Look, visa revocation just means that if you travel, you're going to have to go get a new stamp in your passport before you can come back in. Your status, if you stay put, you're still in status, you're good, but they're revoking that visa in your passport, which is pretty serious. All right? So please be careful. If you are, the most common things I see, you guys might laugh, here in LA, trespassing to get near the Hollywood sign is a common one. And then the other really big one nowadays is you might be driving up the coast, to San Francisco on a long weekend for Thanksgiving. You're driving with your friends and you're driving up the coast and you see whales or seals and you all get excited and you pull over and you run onto the beach and you hop the fence just to go see it. A lot of these beaches are private beaches with not so nice owners, and what you may get is a bench warrant for your arrest for trespass. All right, so that can also happen and create complications for your visa situation. Again, it's not serious in the sense that if you apply for a green card, you will still get it eventually. If you go home and get a visa, you'll get your visa, but they may do a security check. So instead of, a week to get your passport back, it may be 3 weeks to get your passport back because they'll run a security check. All right. There was a student from this school actually who went to some party and he ran across a field to get to his Uber, and it turns out it was a military installation. And he got this very serious arrest warrant and all these charges because it was a military installation. So the school helped them figure it out, so it was okay, but just no shortcuts across fields, I guess is the. So then, of course, the other thing is California, pot is legal in Canada, but under federal law, it is still not legal. So please just be smart about that, because anything related to drugs is the end of your immigration. You're done, all right, until you become a U.S. citizen. So just be very, very careful with that. Yeah.
I have a question about driving with a foreign license. I know in California, the driving code in California allows for foreigners to drive with a foreign license.
But only for a certain period of time.
Yeah, for a certain period. But what if you're
So the easy answer is at some point you need to get a California driver's license.
I mean, is it possible for international students to get a California driver's license?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So they're going to make you take the test, and you have to bring your I-20 and your passport to show you're legal, and they'll give you a driver's license. Yeah. Is that? Oh. Okay, so I think pretty sure this is my last slide. You guys are probably tired of hearing me talk. This is quick. So I know I said earlier that the Trump administration was a little bit sneaky because they passed a bunch of executive orders and memos to sort of get around about changing the legal framework. But just remember, so what often hits the news, especially community newspapers, is you'll always see immigration headlines, right? But be careful, because every year there are dozens of immigration proposals that don't go anywhere. I've actually reached the point about 10 years ago, I stopped paying attention to those headlines and these proposals, because unless it gets passed by the House, by the Senate and the House, and signed into law by the President, it's not law. So there's so much stuff out there. So they've been talking about, they're going to get rid of the H-1B program. They may make some changes to the H-1B program, but they're not going to get rid of it. People talked about the demise of NAFTA for years, but they renegotiated it, and it's now just called something else, assuming that all three legislatures sign off on it. For the last 20 years, they've been talking about getting rid of diversity lottery, and you may remember Trump's 6 months. He was going off about lottery and chain migration. That lottery is still around, but the two things they are getting rid of, the H-4 EAD and entrepreneurial parole. There have been rumors about changes to STEM OPT because one of the tech groups is quite hostile to H-1B workers. But that, I don't know if that's going to happen. That's also a lot of rumors. So until you actually see something become formal through the House and Senate and the President signing something, it's not really it. So I put this in there in case you're a poli-sci nerd and maybe you're interested in how a bill becomes a law, or you can listen to the song. But on that note, thank you for putting up with me for the last couple hours. I'm happy to stay and answer questions. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out.